Listen closely. They tell you that love is a young woman's game, a fiery spark meant only for the springtime of life, destined to fade when the wrinkles set in. Abigail Weston believed that lie with every fiber of her calloused hands and weary heart. At 48, widowed and drowning in the debts of a dying Texas ranch, she had traded poetry for pure survival. She looked in the mirror and saw only dust and fading years. When a quiet, scarred drifter rode into her yard, she told him point blank she was too old for foolish romance. He just tipped his brim, looked through her defenses, and said the words that would burn Oak Haven to the ground. "I've waited my whole life for you." The Texas sun in the summer of 1887 was unforgiving. A heavy, suffocating blanket of heat that baked the earth until it cracked and turned men's ambitions into ash. For Abigail Weston, the heat was just another adversary in a long line of them. She stood on the porch of the Whispering Pines Ranch, a name that felt like a cruel joke now that most of the timber had been sold off to pay the bank. At 48, Abigail was a woman carved from the landscape itself. Her hair, once the color of dark molasses, was now heavily streaked with iron gray, usually tied back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. Her skin was tanned and lined around the eyes, roadmaps of a life spent squinting against the glaring sun and holding back tears she refused to shed. It had been 5 years since her husband, Samuel, passed away from a sudden, violent winter fever. Since then, Abigail had worn her grief like a heavy wool coat, stifling but familiar. Her only daughter, Clara, had moved east to Boston to marry a banker, leaving Abigail alone with 300 acres of dying grass, a dwindling herd of cattle, and a mountain of debt. Abigail wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of a canvas-gloved hand and watched the dust cloud rolling up the main trail. It wasn't a rainstorm, it was trouble. A sleek, black carriage pulled by 2 immaculate roans rolled to a halt near the barn. Out stepped Josiah Caldwell. Josiah was Oak Haven's resident kingmaker, a ruthless cattle baron who owned the local bank, the sheriff, and nearly every drop of water in the county. He adjusted his pristine waistcoat, looking entirely out of place in the dusty yard, and approached the porch with the unearned confidence of a man who always got his way. "Morning, Abigail," Josiah drawled, removing his bowler hat. "Sun's beating down hard today. Looks like your south pastures are completely burnt out. State your business, Josiah," Abigail said, her voice dry and raspy, devoid of any hospitality. "I have fences to mend, and I don't have time to entertain vultures." Josiah chuckled, a cold, rattling sound. "Still got that fire, I see. But fire doesn't pay the mortgage, Abby. You're 3 months behind. The bank is getting restless. I'm here as a friend, offering you a way out. Sell me the Whispering Pines. I'll clear your debt, give you $1,000 for your trouble, and you can buy a train ticket to Boston to be with Clara. It's time to hang up the spurs. You're getting on in years, and this is no life for an older woman alone." The words stung, hitting her deepest insecurities, but she kept her jaw locked. This land was Samuel's dream. "It's my home, and I know why you want it. It's not the grass you're after. It's the deep water rights on the northern ridge. You need it for the railroad expansion." Josiah's smile vanished. "You're a stubborn woman, Abigail. But pride doesn't draw water from a dry well. I'll give you until the end of the month. After that, I won't be coming as a friend. I'll be coming with the sheriff." He turned on his heel, climbed back into his carriage, and rode off, leaving Abigail in a cloud of choking dust. When he was gone, she leaned against the wooden pillar of the porch, the fight draining out of her. She looked down at her hands, rough, scarred, knuckles swollen from arthritis. Josiah was right about one thing. She was tired. She felt old, invisible, and entirely alone. The romance of the frontier had died with Samuel. Now, there was only survival. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, a lone silhouette appeared on the ridge. A man on a tall, robined bay horse was making his way down the switchback trail. Abigail stiffened, reaching instinctively for the Winchester rifle leaning just inside the doorway. In Oakhaven, strangers at dusk rarely brought good news. He rode into the yard at a slow, deliberate pace, letting the horse announce their arrival with a heavy snort. Abigail stood on the porch, the rifle resting casually but pointedly across her forearms. The man swung down from the saddle with the fluid grace of someone who had spent more of his life riding than walking. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dusty, faded canvas duster. When he pushed his wide-brimmed Stetson back, Abigail caught her breath. He was roughly her age, perhaps a few years older. Deep lines bracketed a strong, square jaw, and his hair was a striking silver gray at the temples, but it was his eyes that held her, a piercing, pale winter blue that seemed to look right through her calloused exterior and into the frightened woman beneath. A jagged white scar ran down the left side of his neck, disappearing into his collar. "Far enough, mister," Abigail called out. "We aren't taking visitors." The stranger stopped, holding his hands up loosely to show he meant no harm. "I ain't looking to visit, ma'am. I'm looking for work." His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, carrying the quiet rhythm of the West. "I don't have any money to pay a hand," she replied flatly. "You'd do best to ride on to Caldwell's spread. He pays in gold, assuming you don't mind selling your soul for it." The man smiled faintly, a ghost of a grin that somehow warmed the evening air. "I've met men like Caldwell. I prefer to keep my soul intact. I don't need wages right away. Just a stall for my horse, 3 square meals, and a place to lay my bedroll. I can see your fences need mending, and your barn roof is sagging on the east side." Abigail narrowed her eyes. It was a dangerous proposition to let a drifter stay, but her back was against the wall. The physical labor was breaking her, and she desperately needed help if she was going to hold off the bank. "What's your name?" she asked. "Silas," he said. "Silas Montgomery. I'm Abigail Weston. You can sleep in the tack room. Breakfast is at dawn. If you're late, you don't eat." For the next 2 weeks, Silas Montgomery worked like a machine possessed. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He didn't just mend the fences, he reinforced them. He didn't just patch the roof, he rebuilt the joists. Abigail watched him from the kitchen window, feeling a strange, unfamiliar flutter in her chest. She ruthlessly tamped it down. She was a widow, nearly 50, deeply in debt, and practically at war. She had no business admiring the broad shoulders of a drifter. The fragile piece shattered on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. Abigail was at the well, drawing a bucket, when 3 riders trotted into the yard. Leading them was Harlan Davies, Josiah Caldwell's chief enforcer, a massive, cruel man with a reputation for breaking bones and burning barns. "Afternoon, Widow Weston," Harlan sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to Abigail's boots. "Mr. Caldwell sent us. Said he's worried about your herd, thinks they might have a disease. We're here to quarantine your water supply." One of the men pulled a burlap sack from his saddle, the pungent smell of sulfur and arsenic wafting from it. "They were going to poison her well." "Get off my land, Harlan," Abigail shouted, reaching for the pistol at her hip. But Harlan was faster. He kicked out, knocking the bucket from her hands and sending her stumbling backward into the dirt. Before Harlan could draw his own weapon, a shadow detached itself from the doorway of the barn. Silas moved with a terrifying, silent speed. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply crossed the yard in long strides, grabbed Harlan by the collar of his shirt, and violently hurled the massive man off his horse. Harlan hit the ground hard. His 2 deputies reached for their irons, but Silas was already there. In a blur of motion, he drew a Colt Peacemaker from under his duster, the hammer clicking back with a sound like a cracking whip. He didn't aim at their chests. He aimed right between the eyes of the nearest rider. "Drop them," Silas said softly. The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down Abigail's spine. This was not the voice of a simple ranch hand. This was the voice of a man who had killed, and would gladly do it again. The men froze, slowly raising their hands. Harlan groaned, pushing himself up from the dirt, his face red with fury. "You have no idea who you're messing with, old man. Caldwell will hang you for this." "Tell Caldwell," Silas replied, his blue eyes locked onto Harlan's, "that the Whispering Pines is under new management. If any of you step foot on this property again, I won't ask you to leave. I'll bury you where you stand. Now ride." The men scrambled onto their horses and galloped away, leaving a tense, heavy silence in their wake. Abigail slowly got to her feet, brushing the dirt from her skirt. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a mixture of adrenaline and awe. She looked at Silas, really looked at him. The way he held the gun, the tactical way he had positioned himself between her and the riders, it was professional. "Who are you, Silas?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You're no drifter." Silas holstered his weapon, his expression softening as he looked at her. He took a step forward, gently reaching out to brush a speck of dust from her shoulder. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "I'm just a man trying to keep what's important safe. Abigail, let me take a look at that wrist. You took a hard fall." Later that evening, in the dim, golden glow of the kitchen oil lamp, Abigail wrapped a cold compress around her bruised wrist. Silas sat across the wooden table, nursing a cup of black coffee. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was thick, charged with unspoken questions and a dangerous, undeniable gravity. The drama of the day had stripped away the polite distance they had maintained. The summer days shortened, the heat giving way to the cool, crisp evenings of early autumn. The ranch was surviving, largely due to Silas's relentless labor and his imposing presence, which kept Caldwell's men at bay. But inside the ranch house, a different kind of storm was brewing. Abigail found herself doing things she hadn't done in years. She caught herself humming while baking bread. She spent an extra 5 minutes brushing her hair at night. She looked in the mirror and, for the first time in a decade, didn't just see a tired widow. She saw a woman, and it terrified her. She knew the rules of the world. She was 48. She was supposed to be a grandmother by now. Fading quietly into the background. Romance was for the young, the unscarred, the naive. To allow herself to feel something for Silas felt reckless, like stepping off a cliff in the dark. One evening, after a long day of driving the cattle down to the river, they sat on the porch. The sky was an ocean of stars, the cicadas humming a steady rhythm in the brush. Silas was whittling a piece of cedar, the scent of the wood mixing with the smell of his tobacco. Abigail sat in her rocking chair, clutching a shawl tight around her shoulders. Though the night wasn't cold, she had to end this. She had to establish boundaries before her foolish heart dragged her into a humiliation she couldn't survive. "You should move on before winter sets in, Silas," she said abruptly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Silas stopped whittling. He slowly lowered the knife, turning his head to look at her. In the moonlight, his blue eyes were deep and unreadable. "Move on? I thought we had an agreement. I work, you keep the bank off your back. You've done more than enough," Abigail forced herself to say, her voice cracking slightly. "I can't pay you what you're worth. And people in town are talking. Caldwell is spreading rumors about a widow letting a strange man live on her property." Silas scoffed softly. "I don't give a damn about the whispers of cowards, Abigail. And neither do you." "Maybe I do," she snapped, suddenly standing up, the chair rocking violently behind her. All her pent-up frustration, fear, and insecurity boiled over. "Look at me, Silas. Really look at me. I am not some blushing maiden waiting to be rescued. My hands are like leather. I have gray in my hair. I carry a mountain of debt and a lifetime of grief. The world has moved on. I am too old for foolish dreams, and I am too old for love. So don't look at me like you do." She turned her back to him, gripping the porch railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Tears, hot and shameful, pricked her eyes. She expected him to agree. She expected him to nod politely, pack his saddlebags, and leave her to her solitary decline. Instead, she heard the heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards as he stood up. He stepped up behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He didn't touch her, but his presence enveloped her completely. "Abigail," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated right through her. She shook her head, refusing to turn around. "Don't," gently, firmly. He placed his large, calloused hands on her shoulders and turned her to face him. He reached up, his rough thumb lightly brushing a tear from her cheek. "You think I see a tired woman?" he asked quietly. His eyes locked onto hers with a fierce, burning intensity. "I see the strongest woman I've ever known. I see a woman who fought off wolves, droughts, and tycoons to keep her home. I see beauty that only comes from surviving the fire." Abigail's breath hitched. "Silas, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted softly. "You think I'm just a drifter who wandered into your yard. But I didn't wander." "Abby," she froze, looking up at him. "What do you mean?" Silas took a deep breath, the scar on his neck pulling taut. 25 years ago, I was a 27-year-old cowboy working the South Line for the Miller spread. You were 23, riding a dapple gray mare. You rode past my fence line every Tuesday. I used to spend hours carving little wooden horses, hoping I'd have the courage to give you one. But before I could, Samuel Weston swept in and put a ring on your finger. Abigail's eyes widened in shock. She searched her memory, pulling up a vague image of a quiet, intense, young cowboy by the south fence. "That was you?" "It was," Silas said, stepping closer. "I left Oakhaven because I couldn't bear to watch you be happy with another man. I joined the Rangers. I fought in wars. I chased outlaws. I built a life out of violence and dust, but I never forgot the girl on the dapple gray mare. A few months ago, I heard Samuel had passed. I heard Caldwell was circling you like a buzzard." He reached down, taking her trembling hands in his. "I didn't come here for a job, Abigail. I came here for you. You say you're too old for love? Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, darling." Silas leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers, his voice a fierce, unyielding vow. "But I've waited my whole life for you." Abigail's heart exploded. All her walls, built over decades of hardship, crumbled in a matter of seconds. She let out a choked sob and buried her face in his chest. Silas wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, anchoring her to the earth. For the first time in 5 years, Abigail felt completely, undeniably safe. But in Oakhaven, safety was an illusion. The very next morning, the sound of galloping horses tore through the dawn mist. Abigail woke up with a start, instinctively reaching for her robe. She walked out to the porch, finding Silas already there, fully dressed, his Winchester in his hands. Riding into the yard wasn't Caldwell's thugs. It was Deputy Miller, accompanied by 3 men wearing silver stars on their chests, United States Marshals. Deputy Miller reined his horse in, his face tight with regret. He tipped his hat to Abigail, but his eyes were locked on Silas. "Morning, Abigail," Miller said grimly. "I'm sorry to intrude so early. What is the meaning of this, Arthur?" Abigail demanded, stepping in front of Silas. "I'm not here for you, Abby," the deputy said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "I'm here for him. Josiah Caldwell wired Austin 3 days ago. Turns out, your ranch hand ain't just Silas Montgomery." Miller unfolded the paper, holding it up. It was a wanted poster. The sketch was older, but the scar on the neck was unmistakable. "Silas the Ghost Montgomery." Miller read aloud, his voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "Wanted dead or alive for the robbery of the Abilene Union Pacific train and the murder of 2 guards. There's a $5,000 bounty on your head, Silas. I need you to drop the rifle." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. She spun around to look at the man who had just claimed her heart hours before. Silas didn't look surprised. His face was a mask of cold, hard resignation. He slowly lowered the rifle, looking at Abigail with an expression that shattered her soul. The man she loved wasn't a savior. He was a wanted fugitive, and Josiah Caldwell had just sprung the trap. The heavy iron shackles clinked with a sickening, metallic finality that seemed to echo off the canyon walls long after Deputy Miller snapped them around Silas's wrists. Abigail stood frozen on the porch of the Whispering Pines, the crisp morning air suddenly feeling like a vacuum that had sucked the breath from her lungs. Silas didn't fight. He didn't draw his weapon or make a desperate break for the tree line. He simply locked his pale, winter-blue eyes on Abigail one last time. It wasn't a look of guilt, nor was it an apology. It was a silent plea for her to stay put, to stay safe. As the marshals led him away, hoisting him onto a spare sorrel gelding, the dust kicked up by their departure felt like ashes settling over Abigail's freshly kindled heart. For an hour, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cooling pot of coffee. The man who had touched her face with such tender reverence, the man who had claimed to wait a quarter of a century just to stand in her yard, was accused of murdering 2 guards on a Union Pacific train. "Fool," she whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking. "You old, gullible fool." But as the morning sun climbed higher, casting long, harsh shadows across the worn floorboards, Abigail's grief began to curdle into something much more potent. Rage. She remembered the way Silas had stepped between her and Harlan Davies. She remembered the steady, calloused hands that had rebuilt her barn. A cold-blooded train robber didn't spend his days sweating over a stranger's sagging roof, and he certainly didn't surrender to a posse without firing a single shot just to spare a widow from crossfire. Abigail marched into her bedroom, bypassed her mourning dresses, and pulled out her split riding skirt and a heavy canvas jacket. From the bottom of her cedar chest, she retrieved a heavy, oiled rag. Unwrapping it, she revealed Samuel's old 1,873 Colt single-action Army revolver. She checked the cylinder, loaded it, and shoved it into her holster. She was 48 years old, she had buried a husband, and she had survived 5 Texas droughts. She was not about to let Josiah Caldwell dictate the end of her story. The ride into Oakhaven took less than an hour. The town was a bustling, muddy vein of commerce, completely under the thumb of the Caldwell Bank. She tied her horse outside the sheriff's office, ignoring the whispers and pointing fingers of the townsfolk who had already heard the news. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, and rust. Deputy Miller was sitting at the desk, nervously polishing his badge. "Arthur," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the stifling air like a whip. "I want to see him." Miller stood up, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Abby, you don't want to go back there. The man is a killer." The telegraph from Austin confirmed it. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency has had a file on him since '78. "I don't care if he shot Abraham Lincoln himself," Abigail snapped, stepping closer, her hand resting casually near her hip. "I am the owner of the property he was arrested on. I have a right to speak to my hired hand before the circuit judge gets here. 5 minutes, Arthur. Or I start asking loudly why Caldwell's men were trying to poison my well yesterday." Miller swallowed hard, grabbing the heavy iron ring of keys from his desk. He led her down a short, dark corridor to the holding cells. Silas was sitting on a narrow, dubious cot in the furthest cell, his hands resting on his knees. The shadows caught the deep scar on his neck, making it look like a jagged bolt of lightning. When he saw Abigail, he stood up, his tall frame instantly making the iron cage look suffocatingly small. Miller locked the door behind her and retreated to the front office, leaving them in a tense, heavy silence. "You shouldn't have come, Abigail," Silas said roughly, gripping the iron bars. "Caldwell's going to use this to humiliate you. He'll say you were harboring a fugitive. Let him talk." Abigail stepped right up to the bars, her brown eyes blazing. "Look at me, Silas Montgomery. Look me in the eye and tell me the truth. Did you rob the Abilene Union Pacific? Did you put bullets into 2 innocent men?" Silas closed his eyes, a heavy sigh escaping his chest. When he opened them, the raw vulnerability in his gaze made Abigail's breath hitch. "No, Abby, I didn't." "Then why does a wanted poster have your face on it? Why does Arthur say the Pinkertons are after you?" Silas gripped the bars tighter, his knuckles turning white. In the spring of 1878, I was riding as a deputy U.S. Marshal, working a joint operation with the Pinkerton Agency. We were tracking a vicious gang that had been terrorizing the railways across the plains. We got a tip about a hit on the Abilene Union Pacific. The payroll was heavy, nearly $50,000 in minted gold eagles. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. I was on that train, Abby. Undercover in the baggage car. But it was a setup. The gang didn't just know the schedule. They knew I was there. They blew the doors, gunned down the 2 guards in cold blood. And when I stepped out to stop them, the leader put a hunting knife through my neck and kicked me off the moving train into a ravine. Abigail gasped, instinctively reaching her hand through the bar. Barely, Silas continued, his voice tight with old anger. When I finally crawled out of that ravine days later, I found out the gang had left my marshal star on one of the dead guards. They paid off a corrupt telegraph operator to wire Austin that I had turned rogue, killed the guards, and fled with the gold. The Pinkertons believed it. The law believed it. I became a ghost because if I showed my face, I'd hang before I could speak. Who? Abigail demanded, her mind racing. Who set you up? Silas looked her dead in the eye. The man who led the gang, the man who put this scar on my neck, was Ezekiel Caldwell, Josiah's older brother. The pieces fell into place with a sickening thud. Josiah, Abigail whispered. Josiah was the mastermind, Silas confirmed. He used that stolen Union Pacific gold to buy the bank in Oak Haven, to buy the sheriff, to buy the land. When I heard Caldwell was moving in on your ranch, I knew it was him. I came to protect you, but I also came to put a bullet in Josiah's chest. I just didn't expect him to recognize me first and wire the marshals. Abigail stepped back, her mind reeling with the sheer magnitude of the corruption. Josiah Caldwell wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a thief and an architect of murder. And now, he was going to use the law to silence the only man who knew his secret, all while stealing the Whispering Pines. The circuit judge arrives tomorrow morning, Silas said quietly, his voice losing its fight. Judge Isaac Parker's deputy. They won't bother with a trial, Abby. Caldwell has the paperwork drawn up. They're going to hang me at noon. I need you to go home, pack your things, and take the train to Boston. Go to Clara, please. Abigail looked at the man she loved, the man who had waited 25 years for her, only to walk into a trap for her sake. The fire in her chest roared to life, burning away the last remnants of the tired, defeated widow she had been a month ago. I am not going to Boston, Abigail said softly, her voice carrying a deadly, terrifying calm. And you are not hanging at noon. Abigail didn't ride home. She marched straight from the jailhouse to the grand, imposing brick facade of the Oak Haven First National Bank. The air was getting hot again, the dust clinging to the hem of her split skirt. But she didn't care. She was a woman possessed by a singular, dangerous purpose. She pushed through the heavy oak doors. The bank was quiet. A temple of stolen wealth. Tellers in neat waistcoats counted coins behind brass grills. Abigail ignored them, making a beeline for the frosted glass door at the back that read, Josiah Caldwell, President. Mrs. Weston, you can't go in there. A nervous clerk, Bartholomew Hughes, squeaked, rushing out from behind his desk. Watch me, Bartholomew, Abigail replied coldly, throwing the door open. Josiah Caldwell was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, a crystal decanter of amber whiskey resting at his elbow. He looked up, a smug reptilian smile spreading across his face as he took in her dusty clothes and furious expression. Abigail, Josiah purred, leaning back in his leather chair. I must admit, I'm surprised to see you. I assumed you'd be at home, packing your bags in shame. It's a terrible thing, taking in a drifter only to find out he's a cold-blooded killer. But don't worry, the bank will still honor our offer for the Whispering Pines. We can overlook the scandal. Abigail closed the door behind her, the heavy click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. She walked right up to his desk, planting both her calloused hands on the polished mahogany. "I know about Abilene, Josiah," she said softly. Josiah's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went dead and cold. He reached out, slowly pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "I have no idea what you're talking about, my dear. The heat must be getting to you. I know the gold in your vault belongs to the Union Pacific," Abigail continued, refusing to back down. "I know your brother Ezekiel put a knife into Silas's neck, and I know you orchestrated the whole thing. You aren't a baron, Josiah. You're a cheap thug wearing a stolen suit." Josiah took a sip of his whiskey, setting the glass down carefully. "You have a vivid imagination, Widow Weston, and absolutely no proof. Who is going to believe you? A desperate, debt-ridden woman trying to save her outlaw lover from the gallows? The Marshals have the wanted poster. The Pinkertons have the file. Silas Montgomery will hang tomorrow at noon, and by sunset, I will own the Whispering Pines. If you say a word of this ridiculous story to anyone, I'll ensure you share his fate on the scaffold." He stood up, towering over her. "Now, get out of my bank before I have Harlan drag you out." Abigail held his gaze for 3 long seconds, memorizing the arrogance in his eyes. Then, she turned on her heel and walked out. She had what she needed. Josiah hadn't denied it. He had only challenged her to prove it. She needed proof. Hard, undeniable proof that the money funding Oakhaven was stolen federal payroll. As she walked out of the bank, she nearly collided with young Bartholomew Hughes, who was carrying a stack of ledgers. He dropped them, his face pale and sweating. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Weston," he stammered, scrambling to pick them up. Abigail knelt to help him. As she picked up a heavy leather-bound book, it fell open. It wasn't a standard bank ledger. It was an old, private inventory log from 1878. Her eyes darted over the columns, catching a specific, hastily scribbled note in the margins. "Transfer. 5,000 U. S. Mint Eagles, Series 78. Uncirculated." Silas had said the stolen payroll was newly minted gold eagles. Bartholomew snatched the book from her hands, looking terrified. "Please, Mrs. Weston. Mr. Caldwell keeps that book locked in his private safe. He only took it out today to reconcile some old accounts. If he knows you saw it..." Abigail looked at the young clerk. He was trembling. "Bartholomew," she whispered urgently. "You know what he is, don't you? You know where this money came from." The young man swallowed hard, looking around the empty lobby. "I just add the numbers, ma'am. I don't ask questions. Harlan Davies. He threatened to drown my sister in the river if I ever spoke about the private vault in the basement." "The private vault?" Abigail's heart raced. "Is the gold there? The original uncirculated coins?" "Some of it," Bartholomew whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "He keeps a few bars and coins from the Abilene hit, as trophies. He's sick that way. I need you to let me into that vault tonight, Bartholomew." The clerk violently shook his head. "No, he'll kill us both. He's going to kill an innocent man tomorrow at noon." Abigail grabbed his lapels, her voice fierce and commanding. "You are not a coward, son. Don't let a tyrant build his empire on your fear. Meet me at the alley behind the bank at midnight. You open the door, and I'll do the rest. I promise. I will protect you." That night, a heavy, suffocating fog rolled into Oakhaven, blanketing the town in an eerie silence. Abigail dressed in dark clothes, leaving Samuel's Colt fully loaded at her hip. She slipped through the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She arrived at the alleyway behind the bank. For 10 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Just as she was about to smash the window herself, the heavy iron back door clicked open. Bartholomew stood there, holding a lantern, shaking like a leaf. "Quickly," he hissed. He led her down a narrow flight of stone stairs into the damp, echoing basement of the bank. At the far end stood a massive, Mosler safe door, Bartholomew pulled a heavy brass key from his pocket and began to turn the intricate combination dial. Click, clack, thud. The heavy door swung open. Inside, the vault was lined with lockboxes. Bartholomew went to a specific box in the corner, unlocked it, and pulled it out. He opened the lid. Under the lantern light, the gold gleamed with a dull, heavy luster. Sitting right on top of a stack of bills were 3 heavy canvas sacks. Stamped on the side in faded black ink was the unmistakable logo of the Union Pacific Railroad, dated April 1878. "This is it," Abigail breathed, reaching out to touch the canvas. It was the proof. If she showed this to the circuit judge tomorrow, it would blow Caldwell's empire wide open. Well, a deep, cruel voice echoed from the top of the stairs. "Look what the rats dragged in." Abigail whipped around, her hand dropping to her revolver. Standing at the top of the stone steps, blocking their only exit, was Harlan Davies. He held a double-barreled shotgun, casually pointed right at Abigail's chest. "Mr. Caldwell figured you wouldn't just go home and knit." "Widow Weston," Harlan sneered, slowly walking down the steps. "He told me to keep an eye on the bank tonight. Seems he was right. And you, Barty, you stupid, dead little boy." Bartholomew let out a terrified sob, dropping the lantern. It shattered on the stone floor, plunging the basement into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through a street grate above. "Put the gun down, Abby." Harlan chuckled, the sound grating and dark in the shadows. "You draw that peacemaker, and I'll cut you in half before it clears leather." Abigail stood perfectly still, her mind racing. She was trapped in the dark with a killer, holding the evidence that could save the man she loved. She was 48 years old, and she was done being a victim. "You're right, Harlan," Abigail said, her voice eerily calm, devoid of any panic. "I am too old to draw fast against a shotgun." She didn't reach for her hip. Instead, with a speed born of pure, desperate adrenaline, Abigail grabbed one of the heavy, 5-pound canvas sacks of stolen Union Pacific gold from the lockbox and violently hurled it straight at Harlan's face. The heavy sack of gold struck Harlan Davies square in the bridge of his nose with a sickening crunch. He roared in pain, the shotgun discharging harmlessly into the stone ceiling as he stumbled back. The blast was deafening in the confined space, filling the vault with acrid smoke. "Run, Bartholomew!" Abigail screamed. She didn't wait to see if the clerk followed. She lunged forward, not away from Harlan, but toward him. As he groaned, clutching his bloodied face, Abigail drew Samuel's Colt. She didn't fire. She used the heavy iron barrel to strike Harlan across the temple, sending the giant crashing into the stone wall. He slumped to the ground, unconscious, the shotgun sliding across the floor. Abigail scrambled to gather the fallen Union Pacific sacks. Her hands shook, but her mind was a cold, sharp blade. She shoved the evidence into a burlap feed bag she had hidden under her coat. "Bartholomew, get to the telegraph office," she commanded the shivering boy. "Send a wire to Judge Parker's escort. Tell them the evidence of the 1,878 robbery is at the Whispering Pines. Do not stop for anyone." She didn't wait for his answer. She burst out of the bank's rear exit and into the foggy night. She didn't head for the jail. It would be crawling with Caldwell's deputies by now. Instead, she rode like a woman possessed back toward her ranch. She knew Josiah. He wouldn't just wait for the hanging. If he suspected she had the gold, he would burn Oak Haven to the ground to hide his tracks. Dawn broke over the Texas horizon, not with a gentle glow, but with a blood-red light that seemed to portend the violence to come. By 10 a.m., the town square of Oak Haven was packed. A makeshift gallows had been erected in front of the courthouse. Silas was led out, his face bruised, his gait heavy. He looked at the crowd, searching for one face, but Abigail was nowhere to be seen. A hollow ache settled in his chest. He hoped she had listened. He hoped she was halfway to Boston by now. Josiah Caldwell stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by the marshal and 2 deputies. He checked his gold pocket watch, the very image of a concerned citizen. People of Oakhaven, Josiah's voice boomed. Today, we see justice for the men killed on the Union Pacific. We see the end of a shadow that has loomed over our state for too long. The executioner stepped forward, placing the rough hemp noose around Silas's neck. Silas stood tall, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon of the whispering pines. He thought of the girl on the dapple-gray mare. He thought of the woman who had looked at him with such fierce love in the moonlight. "Any last words, Ghost?" the marshal asked. Silas looked directly at Josiah. "The truth doesn't stay buried, Josiah. Not even in a shallow grave." Josiah's lip curled. "Proceed." The executioner reached for the lever. "Stop!" The cry rang out from the back of the square. The crowd parted as Abigail Weston rode through on her black mare, her hair wild and streaming behind her, her face smeared with soot and sweat. She wasn't alone. Behind her rode 3 men in the distinct dusters of the Texas Rangers men she had intercepted on the trail, led by Captain Thomas Miller, Arthur's older and far more principled brother. Abigail slid from her horse, clutching the burlap bag. She marched toward the gallows, her eyes locked on the marshal. "This man is no killer," she shouted, her voice echoing off the brick buildings. "But the man standing on those steps is—" She reached into the bag and withdrew a heavy canvas sack, holding it high for the entire town to see. "Behold, the legitimate wealth of Josiah Caldwell, stolen Union Pacific gold, minted in 1878, hidden in his private vault." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Josiah's face went from smug to ghostly pale in a heartbeat. "She's lying. She stole that. She's an accomplice." "I have the ledger, Josiah," Abigail countered, pulling the small book from her coat. "In your own handwriting. And I have Bartholomew Hughes, who is currently under the protection of the Rangers at the telegraph office." The marshal looked at the gold, then at the ledger, then at the sweating, panicked Josiah. The tide was turning, and Josiah knew it. "Harlan!" Josiah screamed, looking for his enforcer. But Harlan was gone, and the deputies were backing away, seeing the Rangers' rifles leveled at them. In a moment of pure, cowardly desperation, Josiah pulled a hidden derringer from his waistcoat and aimed it at Silas. Crack! The shot didn't come from Josiah. It came from Abigail. She had drawn Samuel's Colt in a blur of motion, her bullet shattering Josiah's wrist before he could pull the trigger. The derringer clattered to the wooden planks. The Rangers swarmed the steps, pinning Josiah to the ground. Abigail didn't watch them. She ran up the gallows steps, pushing the executioner aside. Her hands were steady as she loosened the noose and threw it to the floor. She reached for the keys on the marshal's belt, clicking open Silas's shackles. Silas stepped down, his breath hitching as he looked at her. He took her hands, those rough, leather-tough hands, and brought them to his lips. "I told you," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm not going to Boston." The trial of Josiah Caldwell didn't take place in the muddy, biased confines of Oakhaven. It was moved to the federal courthouse in Fort Smith, under the stern, unrelenting gavel of Judge Isaac Parker. For 3 grueling weeks of the harsh 1887 winter, Abigail Weston sat in the front row of the gallery, her back ramrod straight, watching the corrupt empire of the Caldwell Syndicate be meticulously dismantled. The ledger she had stolen from the bank, combined with the uncirculated Union Pacific gold and the terrified but truthful testimony of young Bartholomew Hughes, sealed Josiah's fate. When the governor's official pardon for Silas Montgomery was finally read aloud, the heavy iron chains dropped from Silas's wrists with a resounding clatter that echoed through the packed courtroom. He wasn't just a free man, he was a vindicated one. For exposing the architect behind the 1878 train robbery, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and the railway awarded Silas the $5,000 bounty that had once been placed on his own head. By the time they returned to the Whispering Pines, the bitter Texas winter was breaking, yielding to a vibrant, almost defiant spring. The ranch, once a dying patch of dirt, was suddenly thrumming with life. Silas had used a portion of his reward to clear the remaining legitimate debts on the property and purchase a new, healthy herd of red and white Herefords. He rebuilt the corrals, hired 2 young, honest cowhands, and painted the sagging front porch. Yet, as the days grew warmer, a quiet, lingering shadow of doubt began to creep back into Abigail's mind. Silas was no longer a hunted drifter. He was a local hero, a wealthy man, and strikingly handsome in his silver-haired maturity. When they rode into Oakhaven for supplies, she noticed the way the younger, unscarred women at the mercantile looked at him. She looked down at her own hands, weathered, calloused, bearing the indelible marks of a hard life. The old insecurities, deeply rooted and stubborn as prairie grass, began to whisper that this was only a temporary reprieve. One evening in late April, the sky was painted in soft strokes of lilac and bruised peach. Silas was leaning against the porch railing, scraping the mud from his boots, while Abigail brought out 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. She handed him one, her fingers brushing against his, but she pulled away a fraction too quickly. Silas noticed. He set the mug down on the railing and turned to her, his pale blue eyes narrowing slightly in the fading light. "You've been miles away all week, Abby. What's burdening that mind of yours?" Abigail pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, staring out at the rolling green pastures. "You're a free man now, Silas. You have money. You have your name back. You could go anywhere, San Francisco, Denver, back east. You don't have to stay tied to a dusty cattle ranch and a widow who's practically 50. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "If you want to ride on, I won't hold you to promises made when the gallows were looming." Silas didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss her fears with a casual wave of his hand. He looked at her with a profound, aching tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. Without a word, he turned and walked over to his canvas saddlebags hanging by the door. He unbuckled the leather strap and retrieved something small, hiding it in the palm of his large hand as he walked back to her. "Abigail," he said softly, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated with absolute certainty. "I didn't endure a knife to the neck, 25 years of exile, and a date with the hangman just to walk away when the weather turned nice." He gently took her left hand and pressed the object into her palm. Abigail looked down. It was a small, intricately carved wooden horse, a dapple gray mare. The cedar was worn smooth from years of being turned over and over in a man's pocket. It was the carving he had started a quarter of a century ago, the one he never had the courage to give her when they were young. "The women in town look at a man with a heavy purse," Silas continued, stepping closer until she was completely enveloped in his warmth. "But I'm looking at the woman who walked into a dark vault with a killer to save my life. I'm looking at the woman who built a fortress out of sheer will. You think your years are a flaw, Abby? They are your crown. Every line on your face is a map of a storm you survived. I don't want a smooth, unwritten page. I want the masterpiece." Tears, hot and unbidden, spilled over Abigail's lashes. The heavy, iron-clad walls around her heart finally, completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but light. Silas reached out, his rough thumb brushing the tears from her cheek just as he had on that terrifying night months ago. "I told you once, and I'll tell you every day until I'm in the ground. I've waited my whole life for you, Abigail Weston, and I am finally home." As he leaned down to kiss her, a deep, grounding kiss that tasted of coffee, cedar, and an unbreakable vow, the whispering pines swayed in the evening breeze, standing as a silent witness to a love that had defied time, outlasted tyrants, and finally bloomed in the sweet Texas spring. In the end, Oakhaven remembered Abigail Weston not as a grieving widow, but as the woman who broke a tyrant's back with nothing but a sack of gold and a stubborn heart. She proved that the soul doesn't have an expiration date, and that courage is a flame that burns brighter the longer it is tested. Silas and Abigail lived out their days on the Whispering Pines, a testament to the fact that the most beautiful stories aren't written in the flush of youth, but in the enduring strength of a love that survives the winter. Theirs was a real-life legend, a reminder that no matter how much dust settles on a heart, it only takes one person to see the gold beneath. She said she was too old for love. He proved that love was just waiting for her to come home.